good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And welcome to today's Aviation Week Network and IFS webinar, The Future of Flight, Advanced Air Mobility in Asia, sponsored by IFS Asia Solutions. My name is Paul Burton, and I'm the Managing Director for Aviation Week Network in Asia Pacific. I'll be moderating today's event. We just have a few announcements before we begin. Firstly, this webinar is designed to be interactive. The dock of widgets you can see at the bottom of your screen will allow you to learn about today's speaker, download resources, and participate in the Q&A session that takes place at the end of our presentation. The slides will automatically advance throughout the event. You may download a copy of the slides via the resources widget. Towards the end of our webinar, we will ask you to complete our survey found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to fill this out before leaving us today, as your feedback will provide us with valuable information about how we can improve future events. Lastly, if you're experiencing any technical problems, please click the Help widget found at the bottom of your screen, or type your issue into the Q&A box, and we will be gladly on hand to offer one-to-one assistance. So now on to the presentation, The Future of Flight, Advanced Air Mobility in Asia. It's my great pleasure to introduce Scott Camarotti, who is the Chief Revenue Officer, Aerospace and Defence for IFS. Scott is responsible for growing IFS's presence around the world, involving building a strong customer base, expanding the company's network of quality partners, and ensuring the IFS workforce remains engaged and focused on delivery of high-quality customer value. Scott's focus areas include information technology development, consulting, sales, development and leadership of high-performance processes and regulations, serving defense and their Tier 1 and 2 contractors across manufacturing, operations, and in-service support. Scott is adept at forging strong relationships with decision makers in defense and both the military and contractor communities across commercial aviation in the operator and MRO spaces. Scott was honored to be appointed as president of North America IFS Foundation and trustees in 2020. Prior to joining IFS, Scott held various senior global positions in such companies as Software AG, TBI Co., Global Crossing, AT&T, and Verizon Consulting over his 25-year career. So it gives me great pleasure, Scott, to hand over to you. And we will be back in touch probably in about 15, 20 minutes with a poll for you to take. So over to you. Thank you, Scott.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone today. Really happy to have some time to spend with you and appreciate you investing some time with us today. As Paul mentioned, want to keep this interactive. We do have time at the end for some questions, but we're also open to questions along the way. So please feel free to reach out and provide us any questions that you may have. So let's get started. So today we're going to talk about the future of flight, achieving sustained operations for advanced air mobility. And what we've identified, and with the help of other third parties, is that we believe that advanced air mobility is going to be a $3.7 trillion industry by 2050. So massive amount of upswing in revenue for all of us, opportunities for all of us globally, but there's a lot of things that have to happen first in order for us to get there. This is our view of how we see what needs to take place from an ecosystem perspective to allow AAM to actually take off. The technology, the aircraft itself is actually leading the way. The regulatory frameworks that need to be in place for safe operation of the aircraft. AAV manufacturers that really need to scale their business from design, development, and prototype organizations to full production to meet the increased future demand. This is an area that my colleague Matt Medley covered in his webinar last week, and I'm going to take the conversation forward and hopefully provide some additional insights on this topic. This really leaves us with two areas we're going to talk about today, which are required to support the ongoing operations of the aircraft. Sustainment and infrastructure. So, IFS, the future of flight. So welcome to the future of flight. Sustained operations for advanced aviation maintenance. The third in our series of webinars of advanced air mobility. Our first webinar gave a general introduction to the topic of AAM. As mentioned, we did a second one last week that one of my colleagues handled, and we talked about the challenges and solutions to help AAV companies scale their organizations to meet the demand of full-scale production. In the future, we're going to be talking about and looking at the proliferation of autonomous flight as well as the regulatory landscape. So for today, our agenda, we're going to be covering 5 topics. First, we're going to get the brief company overview and introduction out of the way to give a little context to the webinar that we're providing and why we have the point of view that we have. Then we're going to take a look at the infrastructure considerations. We're going to look at AAM maintenance models and the maintenance ecosystem. We're going to look at the global supply chains that are going to absolutely be dependent upon the ability for us to support AAM as it scales. And then finally, we're going to look at enabling systems and how enterprise software can help manage the operations for AAM. So first, a bit of an overview of IFS. IFS today, we operate in over 50 countries. We have over 5,500 employees, and we have a turnover of roughly 1.1 billion in euro. What does that really mean, and how do we compete against the larger organizations that are out there? And the right way in which we do that is by being really focused. IFS only goes to market in 5 unique verticals. That would be aerospace and defense, which we're going to talk about in detail, and we're going to talk here about those sub-industries. We also go to market with energy, construction, and infrastructure, service management, oil, gas, utilities, and discrete management. And the reason why we go to market in only 5 industries is so that we can be more focused and purposeful on building into our tools the business outcomes and the use cases that our customers are trying to derive. The whole goal behind IFS is to provide a fit-for-purpose, out-of-the-box solution that meets the greatest percentage of need of our customers based on the verticals that we serve. And in order to do that, we have to listen to our customers. We have to build the work back into the tools, and then we have to provide our customers with a great level of configurability that helps them to minimize customizations that can become very problematic and very expensive. So within A&D, we really cover 6 different sub-industries. From the left to the right, we cover, didn't advance the slide quick enough, apologies. We cover largely commercial and defense. And within commercial and defense, there are 2 sides of the equation. We have our 6 sub-industries. And I'll take you through this briefly from the left to the right. On the commercial aviation side, we support the airlines and the air operators. Companies like Qantas, China Airlines, Air France, KLM. These are some of our customers that we support. We support the operations of those airlines. Aviation support providers, whether it be airport simulators or logistics. We serve the MRO community, those companies that are doing third-party MRO in support of engine, airframe, or component. As we move toward the right into defense, there's a bit of an overlap in the manufacturers. We support both the defense and the aviation manufacturers, everything in aviation from airframe to engine to component, and on the defense side, anything as simple as munitions all the way up to every maritime aviation or land-based asset that you could imagine. We work very closely with large defense contractors around the globe, and then we also work directly with those defense forces around the globe as well, helping them with their mission. A lot of what IFS does is very asset management focused, supporting the aftermarket support of these complex assets And we do this in a variety of different ways. So that's a brief overview of IFS. I didn't want to spend a lot of time on that, but hopefully that gives you a little context as to where we sit within the industry and why we do have a point of view around the topics that we're going to cover today. So, Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much, Scott. And this is the first of our 2 polling questions. And really, it's, I guess, why we're here today. What do you think is the largest challenge to overcome for the AAM industry to reach its full potential? So if you would take some time to read through those different categories, we'll give you 30 seconds or so to have a think, cast your vote. And then on the next slide, we will see the results in real time, at which point Scott can provide a few insights before walking through IFS's solutions around these different areas. So yeah, give you another 20 seconds or so. Thank you. Scott, if you're a gambling man, sir, which would you say would come out number 1 here?
Well, it's interesting. I think, when I looked at this list originally, I had a certain point of view, and I don't want to spoil the results.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
I can tell you, I was completely wrong with what we found through our analysis. And really, what we'll find as we go through the presentation is there are inputs from all of these different areas that are really challenges to overcome. But we can talk about, as we go forward, how we can overcome them together and what we need to be looking out for.
Sure, thank you. And just another reminder while you're thinking, please feel free to add questions into the Q&A box on your screen at any time. So let's click on and see where we're at. Okay, there we go. Regulation, a resounding first place there, 44%, followed by technology, and then a tie for infrastructure, consumer confidence, and scaling sustainment. So interesting, obviously, regulation with all the different FAA, EASA bodies looking at various facets of the regulation. Unsurprising to see that complicated network coming out number 1. Any quick thoughts on that, Scott?
Yeah, when I looked at this, I thought regulation as well. So I will tell you that I thought regulation was going to be a big driver based on the experience we've had with FAA and other regulatory bodies around the globe. But I feel that as we go through this and as I've learned more, there are other areas that we're going to cover that I think when we don't really think about in a traditional sense of how we're maintaining the asset and the infrastructure to support to maintain that asset, and how that asset is going to be different than traditional aviation assets, it poses a whole different question. So we'll walk through it for sure.
Good stuff. Well, thanks everyone for your votes, and back over to you, Scott. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Okay, so thank you everyone for your time, and this is a nice segue. I can tell you that all the answers to the poll are areas that we're going to now venture into. The first one, of course, being infrastructure. When we look at infrastructure, I think that we talk about it. We're thinking about physical infrastructure that needs to be in place in order for an operation to allow for the support of its vehicles. While there's a lot of attention that's been placed on the development of the advanced air vehicles themselves, there are organizations that are actually working diligently to build up the infrastructure required. Unfortunately, infrastructure is lagging behind the development of the vehicles themselves. And I think we'll see that hopefully change as we move forward. The first topic I'd like to cover in the infrastructure area is conventional energy sources. And when we think about conventional energy sources, one key consideration of infrastructure is that the presence of infrastructure enables vehicle capability, but it also that the presence of infrastructure drives consumer confidence. And with electric ground vehicles, there is anxiety around the range of how far you can go on a charge. And that is oftentimes holding back, at least in my view, in our view, further penetration into the market. And as that energy source improves and the range of those land-based vehicles improve, there's an argument to be made that there's going to be a further proliferation of those vehicles within the ground-based. The range of conventional ground vehicles is only perceived as infinite because you can pull in and fill up anywhere. Whereas if we look at the aviation vehicles, and it really is a little bit different. If we go back to the days of when the car took over for the horse and buggy, it was all about claiming that there was a limited range of gasoline that could power the car because they couldn't refuel on grass and they needed the infrastructure of those gas stations. It's the same with maintenance. We have confidence if we break down, there'll be someone there to repair our vehicle, which gives us confidence to drive. But if we've built up the infrastructure like we have over the last 100 years for people to be able to refuel and maintain their cars, to do the same thing for AAVs, then we're going to be able to get the support and be able to roll this out much more quickly. And the customers and the consumers are going to actually have the confidence to move forward along with the purchasing cycles. So, new energy sources. So what I wanted to talk about here was that regardless of the energy type an AAV is going to use, the infrastructure to fuel it must be built up. So we have to have more electric charging station networks or hydrogen refueling stations. It isn't just the stations that are required. It isn't just the stations that are required. For electricity, we need to make sure that there's grid capacity, preferably from green sources. If we think about all the ESG efforts that are there around the globe and that are becoming really important for all the companies, they all have an ESG initiative. And so looking at green sources of electricity is going to become increasingly important. In some areas of Asia, the overall grid health could be a concern. And we see large organizations like Siemens and Rolls-Royce who are investing heavily in charging, storage, and on-site power generation in solutions like solar in order to try to meet some of these needs. From a hydrogen perspective, we need to build the complete end-to-end delivery system. Need to be able to generate hydrogen at scale. We need to increase the delivery to refueling stations. We need to increase the ability for storage. So these are some of the things that we see as areas that need to be addressed around the new energy sources as it relates to the overall infrastructure. Vertiports. So I'm not sure if anyone knows or has heard the term vertiports. I'm sure many of you have. But in order for these vertiports to become a viable option for the AAVs, we need to be able to provide some way for these aircraft to take off and land safely, and for passengers to be able to embark and disembark. And we believe the answer to this is vertiports. Now, one's not going to just build a host of vertiports over the near term, because we've had over 100 years to build up the infrastructure for traditional aviation travel. And we believe that, utilizing that is one way to meet the vertiport need. A vertiport is not going to be as complex as an airport. They need to be far more plentiful than the airports are, but they need to be also built in areas that already have built-in urban environments. And what we're seeing is some of the most advanced players in the AAM infrastructure appear to be starting by leveraging the existing infrastructure of airports and heliports. So what this means is some of the earliest applications of AAVs are going to be extended to the existing air travel industry with companies like Archer. They're working with an organization called United Airlines, it's the global carrier. They're looking to make flight, more of a virtual door-to-door service, avoiding traffic on the way to the airport. But this doesn't give us all the full potential of air mobility the way we'd like it. So we do need to look at, new vertiports to be built and to be constructed. So when we look at this space, we know that there are new locations that are required. ESA was one of the first major regulators to release standards for vertiports back in March of 2022. The FAA followed up with their engineering brief in September. Some of those will be purpose-built structures built from the ground up, with many AAM players having built mock-ups like show homes, but for vertiports. But in the UAM world, there aren't a lot of greenfield spaces where the people actually are. So infrastructure organizations are looking to repurpose existing structures, and not just, the airports and the heliports, but other areas like building roofs in built up urban environments. Looking at parking garages, they seem like a popular target, but also the SAE International believes that these sites provide for transportation hubs, linking the ground and the air travel together. So it can provide an inclusive use for future autonomous vehicles. Furthering the topic of infrastructure as we look at traffic control. The infrastructure required, to ensure an ongoing large-scale operation, it's not exclusively built infrastructure. We also need systems in place to control the massive step change in air traffic we'll be facing, particularly in these complex urban environments. The traffic control networks, they're going to need to be expanded and reworked to handle new volumes. And they're going to have, defined emergency landing zones, afford for expanded airspace. They're going to need to identify standards for communication between the aircraft, particularly autonomous ones, as they emerge. And this is an area that, oftentimes gets overlooked from an infrastructure point of view, but that we believe is, another component of infrastructure that needs to be thought out clearly and planned effectively in order to give that consumer confidence and to create less barriers of entry into the AAM space. So another answer to one of the topics on the poll was around maintenance. And, maintenance, we believe, is a very important area. And, despite being smaller and generally far less complex than traditional passenger aircraft, the AAVs are still going to need to remain airworthy. And this means that they will be subject to stringent maintenance requirements, not too dissimilar to that of the legacy aircraft that we see today. And so when we look at maintenance, we think that there is, a legacy model that needs to be taken into consideration. And just like we've talked about airports with gas petrol stations, the aviation industry hasn't had over 100 years to build up a complex network of maintenance capabilities. There's a split between the capacity of the operators themselves who provide the maintenance. There's the for-profit maintenance providers, the third-party MROs. And then the vast majority of flights out there are always flying from one location with maintenance capability to another location with maintenance capability. And this is what we call line maintenance at an airport. And this is an area that needs to be addressed with the AAVs within the AAM model. And when we look at this highly skilled, trained global workforce that's there today, the idea is how can we leverage that with the new model? And despite what we're still facing from a documented shortage of trained maintenance personnel for the existing demand, largely brought on by COVID, we do believe that the legacy maintenance model can be leveraged in order to create a new maintenance model to support the AAVs as we move into this next realm of transport for all of us. So light touch maintenance model. So what I'm talking about here, when I'm talking about light touch maintenance model, is it's an area that we believe will be different in the AAM world. And the reason for that is that most of the AAV manufacturers are already designing their vehicles for a light touch maintenance experience. What does that mean? That means there's going to be fewer hangar visits. That means there's going to be maintenance that's going to be able to be performed in the field as opposed to in a hangar that has all the infrastructure associated with it. A much more dynamic way of performing that maintenance of the AAV based on the ability for it to be more mobile. One of the ways that we're achieving this is by using modular designs, particularly around propulsion modules. This means that the electric motors and the motors that are rotary on rotary assemblies can be easily swapped out in the field. What we're seeing is this will emphasize the replacement over repair in the field, which gets the aircraft back into the air much faster. This is going to drive the maintenance downstream to a component level, and it should put a bigger burden on the supply chain. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but we believe that this is going to be an area that needs to be most certainly addressed. And the way in which we think this needs to be addressed, and another way that we look at the new way of maintenance, as I would say, is the way in which we're planning and executing maintenance and how that's going to change. We believe it's highly unlikely that every possible landing site is going to be staffed with technicians and they're going to have a significant level of supplies on hand to perform the maintenance. Instead, the AAV maintenance is likely to follow more of a field service type model, whereas you have mobile technicians. They're going to be out there sent to the aircraft or whatever it is, hopping on board another AAV or even taking a ground vehicle to meet the AAV, bringing spare parts with them. We see this mobile maintenance model as being prevalent and absolutely required based on the number of AAVs that are going to be out there. This completely changes the line maintenance planning and scheduling that are used by operators today. So if you look at the operators, there's going to have to be a new way in which they look at the planning and scheduling of maintenance. And really what this does is it takes a page off of the defense organizations, companies like Saab. They've been doing this for years. They call it anywhere operations. The Saab, the Gripen fighter, which is Saab's probably most prominent fighter, is designed to be able to land and take off from conventional roads. It can have staff that's met there to get the aircraft turned around quickly and airworthy again and back up the air again, no matter where it's forced to land. Now, obviously, there's vertical lift capabilities that are built into that make this possible with this fighter versus others. But that example of how Saab is doing it today, we believe is a leading indicator as to how the new way of doing maintenance can be viewed in the future. Another area that we find to be quite interesting is what the AAV manufacturers are doing. They're trying to keep a hold of as much of the value chain as they can. And what they're looking to do is to keep all the maintenance or most of the maintenance in-house. And in the case where they're acting as the operator, this means building up their own maintenance capabilities and serving all the centers they need to operate. But in the case where they have to act as an MRO to their customers without relying on their existing global network, this becomes a little bit more challenging. So the ability for them to scale this capacity, we believe, is going to be challenging. We believe the AAV manufacturers are going to need help. And particularly with the labor shortages that we've all seen take place with COVID. We still see across all of the aviation spectrum and beyond that, if we look at maintenance across all vehicles, the shortage of labor and the increased need for a new model in order to support the customers the way they need to be supported to have that airworthiness to turn these vehicles around. And with the number of AAV vehicles that are going to be out there on the horizon that we're predicting by 2050 and going to ramp up very quickly, the way to do things differently from a maintenance perspective has to be front and center in the hearts and minds of all those that are involved. So that's really all I wanted to share with you on our perspective on maintenance. What I want to talk about a little bit now is, global supply chains. And I think that, if we look at global supply chains, we've all seen with COVID, they've been strained. They've caused issues across the globe, across all industries, not just aerospace and defense. And we believe that this is going to be an area that needs to be looked at proactively in the AAV space. So, if you look at global supply chains at the highest level, there's two main aspects to the AAM supply chain. Although they're interconnected, the two areas are the production supply chain and the aftermarket or the sustainment of the supply chain. So the aftermarket support of the asset through the sustainment supply chain. Those are the two areas that we see at the highest level within the global supply chain. And if we look at the way in which legacy aviation supply chains operate today, what we find is that, while my colleague Matt Medley talked about this topic briefly, I'm going to go into it a little bit further in my discussion here. All the other aspects of sustained operations that we've discussed today, it's taken a long time to build. The global aviation supply chain is something that's taken a long time to build as well, and it is where it is today. And even still, recent world events have revealed that there's a weakness in the supply chain, whether it be war in Ukraine, whether it be the COVID that I keep referencing, and the shortage of people. And as a result of which, this has this has provided major challenges to our the operators and the MROs around the globe that we've seen. And what we see is that the current state of the supply chain is really oriented toward the operators and the MROs and relying on them, or there's parts pool providers that they need to understand their own stocking levels and manage the demand and then signal that back to the manufacturers. In addition, what we're seeing is that, you know, something that's quite special about the aviation supply chain is its distributed nature. And if you look at the aircraft itself and how it's operated globally out of so many different bases, but you still need spare parts to be managed across a network of locations. And that can become a challenge, obviously. And so those integrated part pooling solutions that you see that include a global integrated supply chain become really important in a dependency in order to be successful. Those locations that are largely fixed are not only at set destinations. They're not just at airports. They're all around the globe. So in order to look at this a little bit differently, we've identified what we believe are some of the new ways in which you could look at the global supply chain, given the challenges that are being faced today, given the increased capacity and demand of AAVs. And the way in which we view this and what we think is that the AAV OEMs, we believe, are going to try to keep a bigger piece of the aftermarket pie. And what this is going to do is this is going to drive a need for an entirely new supply chain. And what that means is there's going to be a supply chain that really needs to be oriented to the OEMs themselves. And that's going to have them holding the burden of the demand planning and the distribution. And that's going to be different from them than what they see today. Not only that, but the AAM players, they're going to spread their implementation sites across the globe. So how does that supply chain spread need to happen, need to take place? That's a challenge that we see, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Instead of a relatively limited set of known supply chains, the supplies are going to need to be distributed at a hyper local level, and this is going to feed the innumerable Veriport locations as they spring into existence. So if you think about the integration of all these different topics that we're talking about today, being highly dependent upon one another, and looking at a new way in which we believe the AAV community are going to need to operate in order for us to be successful, the supply chain plays a major role in that. The second area that we've identified around the new way that the global supply chain needs to operate is really around, you know, modularity of the AAV designs. You know, there's going to be a greater need for a higher number of spares, changing the stocking profile, and a greater need for component level maintenance. This is going to require an orchestration with the supply chain to track those spares that are in maintenance, and then they'll be returning to the field, the ones that are going to be returning to the field, in order to avoid, you know, massively overstocking the spares. Lots of areas of challenges there, but also a real opportunity for us. So that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul for another poll, and then we're going to move on to the latter parts of the presentation and then move to the Q&A. So Paul.
Very good. Thank you, Scott. Lots of food for thought there. And this might help to distill some of your thinking. What do you feel may be the most significant barrier to sustained operations in AAM? So 4 choices there: infrastructure, maintenance, supply chain, or other. And obviously, you know, as you're thinking, if Scott's vision for the supply chain comes to life, and the kind of very localized nature of component maintenance, all these things really are unknowns. But as investment kind of proceeds apace in this area, I think more and more these items will come to light. So it'd be really interesting to know your views on this at the moment. So we'll give you another 20 seconds or so.
So Paul, out of curiosity, what was your choice as far as what you thought on the previous poll was the #1 driver or area of concern?
Yeah, I mean, it was a regulator environment. We've done quite a few studies around that around the globe, and it's very fragmented and difficult. But another observation, when you talk to people outside of our world and the industry about the kind of upcoming kind of rollout of this technology, no one really knows about it. So public awareness, I think, is critical as we start to move through the phases, because it's a mind shift, right, in a localized transportation initially, and I think there's a long way to go before the public is aware of this and then is acceptant of it. So that's another kind of interesting sidebar to all of this, I think, that we can forget quite easily when we're looking at these industry-specific topics.
Yeah, I know you and I were talking before we started today about, the confidence of the, consumer, the confidence of the passenger. And we talked a little bit about certain areas that are leading edge, like Dubai, who've been very public about their goals there. There are others that I've seen. Have you seen any others that are like Dubai that you think are regional areas, throughout Asia, whether it be Singapore or some others that you see to be leading the charge?
I think Singapore is a good example. There's already vertiport infrastructure being put into place in Seletar. So Volocopter are very kind of advanced in the country. And we already had a mock-up vertiport around Marina Bay, one of the main current tourist areas, a couple of years ago. So they are starting to socialize this, I think, a little faster. I think the initial rollout will be very limited and just for kind of tourist use. But, if it functions smoothly, it will be an important bellwether, I think, for the rest of the world to see. Also, thinking about South Korea and Jeju Island as a really self-contained, busy holiday destination that's relatively small, and I can easily see that as being one of the initial areas where it may roll out. Thinking about the Expo in Osaka in 25, I know there's a real aspiration to get it going there as well. So I think you're going to get these pockets of interest really pop up with greater regularity now around the region.
Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
All righty. So let's see. Infrastructure, number one. So obviously pointing to the vertiport issue, by and large, I think supply chain and maintenance coming in at second and third. So quick
Excellent.
Thoughts on that one, Scott?
Thank you, everyone, for contributing to that. As we move on to a next area, we've identified where we believe enterprise software can help to address some of the issues. And one of them is, having enabling systems. There's a lot of automation that's been built over the last 20 or 30 years into systems that provide the ability to support the aviation industry across all the areas, whether it be production planning and control, line maintenance, fleet maintenance, anything compliance related. And we believe that in order to overcome some of the challenges that we've identified, the AAM industry is going to need to put in place robust and capable systems. And we want to talk a little bit here about how we think software can actually help. So as we get into it, a lot of the organizations within AAM are actually startups. And it's really interesting to see this phenomenon of the startups. And they can do great things, with the use of Excel, Google Docs, even custom applications. But when you stretch those tools beyond their intended design, they don't really scale as an organization grows. And so, moving from manual maintenance operations, paper-based, or again, Excel, that doesn't scale really well. And so as the AAM really starts to make inroads into the real world, there's going to be systems that are going to be required. And we believe that, a lot of these systems exist today, fortunately. Facilities like vertiports and charging networks require systems that provide facilities management and field service management to manage those locations. The growing infrastructure network is going to require construction and engineering systems to actually build out the vertiports. From a maintenance perspective, maintenance and engineering and continuous airworthy systems exist today. MRO systems exist today. And if we incorporate field service management and technicians that are doing route planning and scheduling optimizations into maintenance that can actually enhance the maintenance support that's going to be required, for those AAVs. Additionally, when we look at supply chains, we really do believe that there are systems that are out there today that can manage a complex network of suppliers, as well as looking at the globally distributed supply chains that you have to take into account. And the configuration management requirements of the aviation industry are driving some of those supply chain requirements that are actually in systems that are available today. So let's talk a little bit more about the enabling systems and some of the considerations as we look at supporting AAVs specifically. So if I were to look at the systems that are going to enable growth and transformation, I believe it's important to bear in mind three considerations. For organizations undergoing massive growth, I do believe scalability is key, especially for those organizations that are startups. And so if you look at some of the rigid or complex systems, they're just not going to work for a smaller agile company. So as companies grow and they need richer functionality in order to keep pace, you're going to find customers, they're going to need to grow their business, and otherwise they're going to be taken over by others based on their poor performing systems. And in order for them to have their business not grind to a halt and not have to go back to the drawing board looking for something new, they need to leverage systems that are out there today across a broad range of software and technology providers, one of which is the company I work for, but there are lots of options out there. Similarly, systems that offer a breadth of functionality in a modular manner, they're going to allow AAM companies to roll out new aspects of their business as they come to market. And this should allow for a seamless expansion while remaining interconnected. This takes us to the importance of integration or the interfaces. And if we look at the world of AAM, it's such a data-rich environment. And the ability for organizations to take vast quantities of testing data from the field, to interpret it, to apply logic to it, and then quickly allow the industry to develop solutions based on the access and analysis of that data is really important. And those systems, again, we do believe operate today, but it's the integration point that I'm trying to make clear that's really required. And if you look at structured data, unstructured data, Hadoop clusters, what have you, it's really, really important for those integrations and those interfaces to be available to you. And if you don't have the interfaces and the integration, then you're going to have this complex ecosystem of systems that you can't maximize because you can't use the data quickly and effectively. And so that really goes back to data, the explosion of data, and the ability to use and harness that data for value. Not many of those systems today are in a manner that's not siloed. So the modular ability of the systems and the integration of those systems, and the need for that to become more integrated, we believe is a really important element in order to support AAV and the AAM market overall. Whoops. So what we got here. Sure. Going to the next slide. So what I'd like to say is, as I've covered all the topics I've covered today, I want to conclude with a few things. In the AAM space, whether you're a manufacturer, whether you're an operator, whether you're providing maintenance services, or whether you build and manage the infrastructure and other services to support AAVs and AAM, or even if you plan to offer products and services to the defense sector, there are systems available for you today that can help you unlock the potential in AAM, as AAM really revolutionizes travel and transport around the world. And if anyone has any further questions for me, we're going to put them in the chat. If you have any questions for me after the session, you can reach me based on the contact information you're going to have. But when I look at this space, the challenges we've talked about today, I do believe that technology is going to be a strong driver to support some of the requirements as we pivot from traditional aviation transport into the AAVs in a much more complex, much more largely scaled number of vehicles that, quite frankly, even from my point of view right now, is a bit scary. But with the right organizations working together, addressing these topics, which I believe they are, leveraging technology, I believe we can all get there together. So I want to thank you for your time today. Hopefully some of the insights that I shared are informative. If you have any questions, I think we're going to open it up right now for questions, Paul, and I'll leave it with you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Scott. And thank you so much, everyone, for your kind attention and spending time with us today. I hope, like myself, you found it very informative and just kind of the dazzling array of different areas and issues under consideration at the moment within the emerging AAM space. So before we start with the Q&A, if you'd be so kind as to direct your attention to our webinar survey, which is available on the right-hand side of the presentation window. If you inadvertently close this survey, you can just reopen the widget by clicking on the clipboard icon along the bottom of your screen. So thanks in advance for filling out the feedback form. Participation is really important to help us serve you even better in future webinars. So we will head over to the Q&A, and we've got a few coming in. So I'm going to start you with a relatively broad one, Scott, if that's okay. And I've touched on this before, but I think it would be really helpful to get your insights into where you think AAM will roll out across Asia, where that we haven't mentioned before might you see as being a pocket of activity kind of emerging faster than the others?
Yeah. I think, when I look at the Asia market, obviously it's massive, and certain countries are going to have a big stake in it. But I'll tell you a little bit about when I looked at the Asia market prior to this discussion. And I looked at a study that was released by Rolls-Royce and Roland Berger. And what it showed is that 51% of the AVAs in operation in 2050 are forecasted to be in Asia-Pac. But interestingly, only 41% of the revenue was associated with that region. When I looked further, that same study identified China as the #1 predicted driver of revenue in this space, with roughly a $40 billion revenue associated with AAM, excuse me, by 2050. Japan was second at 14 billion, and I know that there's some customers and companies that have heavily invested in AAM startups like JAL and ANA that are in Japan, followed by South Korea and Australia, and then Singapore, which is really in the top 5, and despite being smaller relative to the other countries that I've mentioned, really identifying 350 to 400 million of revenue for Singapore themselves in the AAM space. So I think across Asia, extremely complicated, long distance, multiple countries, multiple cultures, always going to be a challenge. China will always be, I think, the leader as far as driving revenue, but the other organizations throughout Asia are also going to play a major role, the ones I've mentioned. And I believe that, it's going to be an area that's going to drive, again, 51% of the operations in 2050 are going to come across Asia. And that's supported by the study I mentioned. So hopefully that answers your question, Paul, or the question that was raised.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. Interesting, with China, one of the first movers here was off the EHang, and they were very, very lively many years ago, and still developing quickly. And obviously the regulatory environment with the CAC is somewhat different to the rest of the world. So always worth watching developments there, particularly as more and more startups are coming on stream in that market. This is an interesting one. What would you depict as the significant differences between a vertiport and a heliport? And I asked that one because I think that it's difficult to visualize some of that kind of infrastructure at the moment. So it'd be great to have your views on that.
So when I look at vertiports and heliports, the vertiport can obviously take use of a heliport's infrastructure. But the vertiport, I think, can be much more nimble, much more lower in scale. What I see some of the vertiport organizations that are focused on vertiports, what they're doing today is they're looking at urban areas. What their thought is that we have to have the availability of the AAVs to the consumer within the urban areas. And what does that mean? That means looking at rooftops. That means looking at parking garages. That means looking at open green spaces. And so those vertiports, I think, are going to look less infrastructure heavy than a heliport is. And there's going to be a need for much more of them. And they're going to leverage, I think, if we're going to look at the ability to scale as quickly as we need to, existing infrastructure to repurpose buildings to build out the vertiport infrastructure to meet the needs. So I think it's going to look a little bit different. But that being said, a heliport could also serve as a vertiport. And that's obviously easy, but there's just not enough of them. Not enough.
And your point around the location of the vertiports, I think, plays into one of the polling questions around public acceptance and local planning. Could take a long time for, say, a garage or a parking lot to get the approval to become a vertiport. So there's that kind of factor as well.
It is. It is. You look at how cell towers started popping up all over the place, and the level of infrastructure and compliance and regulation from a telecom perspective around that. The vertiport's slightly different, but you still need the access, and the accessibility for the consumer is really the key to the vertiports being the infrastructure that they need to be. And it has to be easily accessible. People are not going to drive long distances to go to a traditional airport. They're going to require vertiports for this type of short travel.
Absolutely. Okay, we can't have a conversation around the sector without bringing in sustainability. So I'm going to cluster a couple of questions here for you, Scott, around the evolution of battery tech and how significant it is in making AAMs operationally viable, sustainable, and also around, let's see, there's another, around fuel as well. So I guess that's the kind of same issue. Thoughts on that, please.
So I think it's really important, and obviously the ability for electric and the use of batteries is really going to be key, I believe, for the AAVs to operate the way in which we all envision them to, whether it be air taxis or what have you. Some of that is actually, some of that infrastructure and some of that technology is actually there today. There's a company that is in the States, so it's not as relevant for Asia, but there's a company in the States that actually is moving toward an all-electric fleet. And what they have is they have small aircraft that have a range of up to 500 miles. They can hold 7 passengers and 2 crew, and they can meet a top speed of approximately 350 miles per hour. And that exists today in commercial aviation, as some of the regional smaller guys are trying to become more ESG focused and lower the carbon footprint and move away from traditional fossil fuels. So that to me is encouraging. If I look at the work that's being done in traditional vehicles that are electric vehicles today, there is so much focus by government putting so much money into research and development to expand the range of the batteries in order for those cars to operate. That can and is being leveraged by the AAV manufacturers in order to factor that into their production, their manufacturing, and then their overall that value that they can provide to the company. So just a quick example of one that's doing it today. And then really, I think we're going to benefit in our space here with what's being done in traditional electric car vehicles and the government money that's going into it, which is just massive. But without it, definitely a hindrance. And the range is going to be dependent upon the battery, because it's not going to be just range of one flight. If you're an air taxi, you're going to be taking off and returning back and forth again, hopefully over a long period of time of short stops. In order for that to take place, there's batteries are going to have to be more robust than they are today. And that's something that I think, as we look at the next, I think 10 to 15 years, that technology will really round itself out based on what I'm seeing today.
Thank you. This one's more of a macro level question, but I think really important to kind of consider, and that's around overall economic trends at the moment in major economies, and questions around, the robustness of the US economy over the kind of short, medium term. Do you think funding for this technology will continue to be as robust as it has been over the past 2 or 3 years?
I do. I think that, and the funding really depends upon what area you're talking about. I mean, there's funding in support of the technology to enable the vehicles like the batteries. There's funding around building out the infrastructure. There's funding around ensuring that the systems are available and that the regulators have been able to transform their business to support this type of new environment. So there's a lot of different funding vehicles or funding areas that need to be touched upon. But I do believe that because of the ability to lower the carbon footprint, and there are so many countries out there that are really dead set on being all electric or, getting fossil fuels out, whether it be India or some of the other countries that we see that are making claims to do things by 2030. I believe that the government is going to continue to invest, but I also believe that you're going to see a lot of private sector investment here as well, Paul. It's not just going to be government money. And while the economies in some areas are pretty robust and the governments are investing, I think that private sector is going to actually ramp up more investment in this area because they're going to see a long-term return on their investment, and they're going to see the ability for profitability, maybe not over the near term, but over the long term. And over the near term, if they're leveraging some of the government subsidies and you combine the public and the private together, then I believe you see a win-win for organizations as we all benefit from the investment that you asked me about.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more before we wrap up. So kind of shifting gears now, looking towards maintenance and repair. Do you think the manufacturers themselves can handle all of that, or are there more opportunities, do you think, for independents to spring up in this space?
Yeah, I think some of the well-funded ones are going to be able to do it. I think that, the ability for them to scale quickly, it's going to require them to have partners. And I think in the case of a manufacturer trying to do maintenance themselves, they really need help from the MROs. And I don't believe that this is going to be a scenario where it's going to be the first one out of the gate is going to be the one that's going to win. But I think it's going to be the companies that can scale the fastest. Those are going to be the ones that are going to rise to the top. And I do believe that while the manufacturers may find a way to perform the maintenance themselves if they're well funded, I believe a better path for them is through partners. And I do believe that this is going to enhance the opportunity for MROs to be a major player in this market.
Fantastic. Thank you, Scott. I'm sure we could carry on for another hour or so, but mindful of the time for you in particular. But thank you so much for joining us. And once again, a real tour de force around this very diverse and difficult kind of space to really forecast. So thank you so much, Scott, for your insights, and for IFS Solutions Asia for sponsoring today's webinar. So just leaves me to say, within the next 24 hours or so, you'll get a personalized follow-up email with details and a link to today's presentation on demand. Please feel free to share with your peers and colleagues who may not have been able to attend. So thank you so much indeed for your time, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Scott, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.